The poetry of Alexander Vedinsky, a prominent Russian poet of the avant-garde, has not yet been studied in a large international context. This year has seen the publication of his collected poems in English for the first time. Several scholarly attempts have been made to compare his poetry with the European drama of the absurd, Eugène Ionesco and Samuel Beckett, for example, and French surrealism, Henri Michaud, René Daumal, and Tristan Tzara. In this paper, we will consider Vedinsky's poetics versus the literary experiments of Gertrude Stein, a leading figure in experimental literature of the early 20th century. I should mention here Carolyn Copeland's book on language and temporality, published in 1975, which discusses the issues of time in Stein's writings, which is relevant for the topic of our conference. The era of the early avant-garde is marked by a keen concern about time and temporality. At that, given that there were absolutely no historical contacts between the two authors under my consideration, I will base my analysis on a typological and contrastive investigation of both authors' poetic grammar in their respective languages. I will specifically address the concept of time and temporality, which is central to the style of both Vedinsky and Stein, and which has a radical effect on the language of their poetry. I will argue that linguistic experimentation in their writings is largely dependent on their reconsideration of time as a category of thinking. The basic theme of Gertrude Stein's works is, according to her own words, the transformation of objects. The same topic is highlighted in Alexander Vedinsky's lines from his play God May Be Around. In our posthumous rotation, the one salvation is transformation. It is not the things themselves that matter, but the shift of things into other things. The very act of metamorphosis is key to both authors. This principle makes us think of Bertrand Russell, a major philosophical influence on Gertrude Stein, with his claim that the world consists of events, not of things, that endure for a long time and have changing properties. In Stein's poetical vision, words do not describe reality, they are reality. Let us look at the following passage from Tender Buttons. A hurt-mended stick, a hurt-mended cup, a hurt-mended article of exceptional relaxation and annoyance, a hurt-mended, hurt and mended is so necessary that no mistake is intended. What is important here is not the description of an object, of a stick, a cup, of any other object, nor their presence, but the events that unroll in the grammatical world. The stick, the cup are as eventful as their properties, hurtness, mendedness, etc. Stein's experimental grammar is akin to Wittgenstein's language games, which is the subject of Marjorie Perloff's insightful book on this topic. The transformational and transient nature of Stein's and Vedinsky's grammatical logic corresponds to the transience of mind and thought in their vision. The concept of fluidity in Vedinsky correlates with Stein's concept of processuality. Here I cannot exclude a common source for both authors, the philosophies of Bergson, James, and Whitehead, conceptualizing the world in terms of event, process, and duration. For example, William James, Gertrude Stein's director of research when she was a student, claims that mind is always in the process of perpetual change. No state of consciousness can be repeated or identifies with any preceding state, in his view. The interest of Vedinsky and Stein towards the issues of mind and mentality results from the general gnoseological attitude of both authors to language. Vedinsky aspired for a poetical critique of reason, which was ascertained by his first critic and friend, Yakov Druskin, who called Vedinsky's method poetical gnoseology. Similarly to this, Stein rejects the logic of scientific language in favor of new poetical logics. I quote from Poetry and Grammar. And so I went on with this exceeding struggle of knowing, really knowing what a thing was, really knowing it, knowing anything. I was seeing anything I was feeling, so that its name could be something, by its name coming to be a thing in itself, as it was, but would not be anything, just and only as a name. Thus, the two poets raise the essential issue of the limits of language and consciousness. Meanwhile, the problem of discontinuity of language and time is tackled differently by Gertrude Stein and Alexander Vedensky. In this respect, Vedensky writes in his grey notebook, "All that I am trying to write here about time is, strictly speaking, untrue. The reasons for this number two. First, any person who has not understood time at least a little bit, and only one who hasn't understood it has understood it at all, must cease to understand everything that exists. Second, our human logic and our language do not in any way correspond to time, neither in its elementary nor in its complex understanding. Our logic and our language skid along the surface of time." End quote. Therefore, Vedensky claims that there should be a new logic that could describe the deeper layers of time. He endeavors to reconstruct time as such, independently of its linguistic denominations. Assuring himself of the invalidity of former logical connections, he seeks for new types of connections in his poetry. In his own words, they should express his basic feeling of the world's incoherence and the time's disintegration. Gertrude Stein, too, is not satisfied by the popular concept of time, as she is convinced of its falsity. However, she differs from the Russian poet in that she is much more preoccupied with the current moment of thought and speech, as though it was statically suspended in the present time. Hence the pronounced tautological nature of her poetry and prose. A verb is followed by another verb, but no action really takes place. Only the static present moment is emphasized. The issue of time is closely associated with the topic of memory. Vedensky skeptically declares in the Grey Notebook, "I do not put my trust in memory nor in imagination. Time is the only thing that does not exist without us. It devours everything that exists outside us. Here falls the night of the mind. Time ascends above us like a star." Likewise, in making her poetical portraits, Gertrude Stein insists that the artist should not recollect the features of a model landscape or still life. Instead of using the mechanisms of memory, the true artist should activate the mechanisms of oblivion. There is no remembering, she reiterates in her essay Portraits and Repetition. Stein tries to write as if there were no patterns of memory. The poetical knowledge should be based exclusively on experiencing the present moment. Freed from memory, the logical contradictions are not resolved, as they are either not noticed, or the two adherent utterances do not remember each other. Like, for example, in these lines from Portraits and Prayers. Memory, in Stein's vision, is an enemy of creative thinking. In any moment free of memory, a person reveals his or her creative essence. She writes, "At any moment when you are you without the memory of yourself, because if you remember yourself while you are not for purposes of creating you." The difference between Stein's and Vedensky's conceptions of memory lies in the fact that the former explains the falsity of memory by the state of things in new reality and contemporary avant-garde art, whereas the latter deprives art of mind of the very possibility to have anything in common with memory, due to the disintegration of time and the incoherence of things. As memory, according to Vedensky and Stein, is not relevant to the process of writing poetry, repetition ceases to be tautological. The same word repeated twice is not the same word anymore. Repetition plays a key role in Gertrude Stein's writings, determining the specific poetic grammar of her texts. "I believe in repetition," she notes in her diaries. The repetition of the same element is not mechanical. The repeated element of a series always appears in a unique syntactical position, which cannot be repeated twice. Like, for example, in this excerpt from her poem called An Elucidation. Every little word in this poem occupies a particular place in the line and in the poem. The phrase, "May I see," being repeated 5 times, occupies a unique place, each time in a different surrounding. A similar kind of repetition may be found in Vidensky's poetry, as in this one called I Regret That I'm Not a Beast. I'm frightened that I'm not the grass that is grass, I'm frightened that I'm not a candle, I'm frightened that I'm not the candle that is grass. Repetition of this kind was of crucial significance to the Russian poet. According to his friend Yakov Druskin's memoirs, in reciting this poem, Vidensky specifically accentuated this transposition of words, candle and grass. The poet himself later commented, I quote, "There are many repetitions here, but I think I need them all. If you look carefully, they reiterate differently, as if explaining, and the pairs candle that is grass and grass that is candle are very important for me." End quote. The composition of reiterated sequences is aimed here at fragmenting the time sequences of perception. In structuralist terms articulated by Yuri Lotman, the same, that is repeated elements, are functionally not identical if they occupy structurally different positions. This principle can be illustrated by Gertrude Stein's example from Ida, a novel, where the word morning is repeated 3 times as such and 1 time slightly differently. The same repeated elements uncover the structural difference of parts of poetic text, making it more evident, and the accumulation of repetition results in semantic diversity of the text. Gertrude Stein also proposed a specific kind of repetition, which she called insistence. By this she meant cases where the repeated element undergoes the slightest change, that is a minimal but marked difference with every little series. Like, for example, in this little line from her essay, How to Write. The structure of such repetition supposes that in Stein's and Vidensky's texts, the logical connections are arranged not in an hierarchical, but in a serial way. It is worth noting that in the same years, 1920s, 1930s, serial logic was the subject of study of the Irish philosopher of science, J.W. Dunn, who published his book An Experiment with Time in 1927. He examined the phenomena of arts and physics and discovered a special state that certain objects fall into, the state of process, perpetual and multidimensional. The same discovery was made by Gertrude Stein, namely her famous line from Sacred Emily, "Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose." Thus, Stein's serial grammar in repetition is analogous to Dunn's idea of a serial universe. Both Vidensky and Stein have an intensely concentrated attitude towards the word, as such. Stein prefers an abundance of sense aroused by a minimum of words. She writes, "It takes a tremendous amount of inner necessity to invent even one word." She is passionate about the many meanings a word can acquire in slightly changed contexts. Vidensky, quite on the contrary, respects the poverty of language, the inability to express meanings. Every word for him is an obstacle to understanding, as the system of words comprising language keeps us away from pure communication with the world. Real art for Vidensky opens the possibility of positive misunderstanding. To understand such things as time, death, and God, we need to begin with misunderstanding, with questioning language about its ability to refer to the real world. Quote from the Grey Notebook. "Before every word I put the question, what does it mean? And over every word I place the mark of its tense." As we can see from these reflections, Vidensky's concept of temporality interferes with the text in all its continuity, making the true meanings of the words used unclear. The word candle, just like in the example cited earlier, ceases to produce the same meaning as it did just a moment ago, being broken by the fragmentation of time. The word candle is thus solitary. Pronounced several times in a row, like the word rose in Stein's famous iteration, it remains the same, but the sense becomes different with the flow of time. Each new minute, each new second of perception makes it a new entity in no logical connection with the previous minute. The drama of misunderstanding of a word unfolds due to the disruption between the sameness of form and the difference of apprehension. But this drama makes way to a deeper, general and wild non-understanding, in Vidensky's words. If we try and write something about time, he insists, or if not about time, then on the non-understanding of time, we can at least try to fix those few positions of our superficial experience of time. Woe to us who ponder time, he laments. But then Vidensky argues, with the growth of this non-understanding, it will become clear to you and me that there is no woe, neither to us, nor to those pondering, nor to time. This is what he calls the positive non-understanding, or otherwise the star of nonsense. If we now think about grammar, we have to ask ourselves, how is time and temporality categorized in this poetic world deprived of temporal continuity? The objects and properties expressed in nouns, pronouns, and adjectives are no longer stable. Their identity is falsified. All that is left that can be trusted is perpetual movement. And perpetual movement is naturally better conveyed by verbs. The most interesting common point of Vidensky's and Stein's poetics is their treatment of the verb as a grammatical category. According to Stein, one should avoid or reduce our usage of nouns in poetry. Beside the nouns and the adjectives, she writes, in poetry and grammar, there are verbs and adverbs. The advantage of verbs over nouns is that the former are in constant movement, and they express more intensely the dynamics of the current moment. Moreover, she explains, verbs and adverbs are more interesting. In the first place, they have one very nice quality, and that is that they can be so mistaken. A mistake in poetry is good because it opens ways for endless production of sense. This is a passage from Making of Americans, I guess. Why then do verbs have the possibility to be mistaken? Because they contradict the law of logical connections. Better. Whereas names are more fixed in meaning. It is not by chance that all scientific logic and rationality is based on the nominative lexicon of language. Verbs, on the contrary, are logically freer and less predictable. The present participle, according to Stein, produces the effect of decelerating or extending the syntactical rhythm. Almost the whole of Stein's novel, Making of Americans, is based on using these forms, which corresponds to the author's attitude towards the present immediacy. Gerunds, for example, are thought of as the stasis of movement, a momentary shot of the process. Substantivizing the process, the gerund sort of encloses it in time brackets, like Edmund Husserl's epoche, and makes the process easily perceived. The boosting of continuous tenses, like ones you can see on the screen now, is aimed at reproducing the making of the text itself. By doing so in poetry, Stein fills the semantic and grammatical gaps not available in everyday language. As for Vidensky, he too thinks that verbs are more appropriate for his poetic vision. As we understand them, verbs exist as if all by themselves, he writes. Besides, verbs are mobile, they are flowing, and thus they resemble something truly existing. Meanwhile, even if verbs, according to Vidensky, have time, they also are subject to be captured by intangible and elusive time. This is how it is expressed in poetic form from the Grey Notebook. I thought about why only verbs are subjugated to the hour, minute, and year, while house, forest, and sky, like Mongols of some kind, have suddenly been released from time. So if for Stein verbs win over nouns in a better and more pure expression of the world, for Vidensky even the verbs, which are much friendlier with running time, live out their life. Verbs live out their life right in front of our eyes, he writes. He is skeptical about verbs because they claim to be the true reflection of time in the structure of language. Actions in his poems are illogical and senseless. They cannot be called actions anymore because action is a noun again, so it doesn't exist. For example, the sentence, "A person put on a hat and walked outside," is not adequate according to him. More appropriate and real would be the sentence, he put on his hat and it was getting light, and the blue sky took off like an eagle. He comments at the end. Events do not coincide with time. Time has eaten the event. Not even the bones are left. So, in juxtaposing the two conceptions of time and their realization in the poetry of Alexander Vedensky and Gertrude Stein, I came to the conclusion that both independent poetic systems demonstrate a similar interest towards temporality and the essential role of time in poetic experimentation. For both authors, time has to be conceptualized differently from its everyday understanding and scientific treatment. What differs, though, in the approaches of Stein and Vedensky is the degree of skepticism about ordinary understanding of time. For Stein, time can be understood only in the form of present immediacy, whereas for Vedensky, time is absolutely incognizable by means of logical language conceptualization and cannot ever be understood. Stein's continuous conception of time is opposed to Vedensky's discontinuous vision of temporality. What is common in these two authors, though, is a strive for radical reconsideration of time conceptualization in language, and the recognition that poetic grammar can be recreated in order to overcome ordinary language restraints in thinking about time. Now, to finish with, I'd like to quote a few lines from Vedensky's mystery play, God May Be Around, where, in answering the question, do you even know what time means, a character called F admits that he's not acquainted with time, and he also admits that time is fiction, it's an ideal. Thank you for your attention.